been much too long, Patrick.
It's been a long time.
But we haven't given up on this
now.
podcast.
No, we haven't.
Or on each other.
We've used modern transportation to find ourselves in the same place. How are you?
Well, I've been better. My life has been defined, by a lot of luck usually. Like I have a lot of people say I have a blessed existence, and I don't disagree with them. And in the last month, that premise has been challenged a little bit by a series of tragedies. And first, a month ago, a wonderful, wonderful woman who was living with us just mysteriously disappeared. And while we don't know what happened, all evidence points to suicide, because she talked about it in her diary and had spoken about it with several people before. And that was just really hard to deal with, as you can imagine. And then now, almost exactly a month later, one of my closest friends and collaborators, Steve Shigley, known to all of us, friends of his as Shig, who had been one of the most kind of prolific and brilliant artists in the Bombay Beach community, and just a real kind of prominent member of the creative desert set that has become my kind of extended family. I had given him a place to stay in Bombay Beach, and he had created so many important works there, from the Tesseract. That was the first one we collaborated on. He does metal work.
Is that the cube?
Yeah, it's a hypercube.
Yes. Four-dimensional cube.
And maybe I'll tell the story later of how that came about. It's one of the most brilliant pieces of work in Bombay Beach. But anyway, I have a few properties there, and I had given him one of them to call his own, and he had put this trailer, and he had this brilliant way of kind of creating spaces with his sculptures, and he was very fastidious, kind of, even though he seemed like a crazy kind of desert artist, he also just was extremely neat and precise, and always was just making the most subtly beautiful spaces wherever he went. And he had set up a little canned hemp trailer, and he had his metal work everywhere, and it made a little fountain out of a cowboy tub, and he had this 8-year-old daughter who he was just very depressed about not having seen for the last 2 years because of COVID, and her mother's Canadian and lives in Canada, and traveling had been difficult, and you could see he also just had a general kind of issue with depression, obviously, for those of us who knew him. But last week I was worried that something was wrong, and I asked a friend of mine to go check on him, because I was down there and saw his space all inhabited but no sign of him. And I left, and I had a feeling something was wrong, and I asked a friend of mine who was in Bombay to go check on him, and he had shot himself. And I realized that if I'd just taken one more step when I checked on him, like just one more step to the right, I would have found his body that had been there for several days. And anyway, this has just been, I'm usually very good at finding the silver lining on every situation. I'm pathologically optimistic, I think sometimes. But it's hard to find the optimism in this scenario when somebody who's just so wonderful and loved and does this so violently and so brutally, and so leaving behind a little girl who's never going to recover from this, a mother, and a sister, and so many friends who just loved and adored him. And it's just hard to make sense of it, except if you think death is just the best thing that happens to us. But I just find that hard to. Anyway, you've had some experience with suicide too, and so we decided maybe this would be, even though we're celebrating reuniting, it's under difficult circumstances, and we want to talk about this.
So do you think, like, Shig's art, so someone who's been to the desert compound or the desert space that's yours, like which pieces are Shig's? Like, is there a way to describe the art?
Yeah, it's funny because
Is the red one, the red?
Yes, the red
Yeah.
sculpture by my swimming pool. What's interesting is, and I was writing about this yesterday, what's interesting is that he was such a kind of speedy, frenetic character, always seeming ill at ease, always kind of, running from one place to another, always a bit nervous, his energy. But his pieces were the opposite. They were very minimalist, very elegant, very kind of...
Very strong. Not strong in like a obviously masculine way, but just in the, like, you can't move them. You can't touch them. They're firm. They're like features of the landscape now. Like they were built in, you can't move that red sculpture. You can't move the Tesseract.
No, they're just there. And it's the opposite of him in a way. It's like what I was writing about and thinking about is the fact that maybe, obviously people have some sense of their own destiny often. And if there was a part of him that knew that he wasn't going to stick around, the idea of leaving something behind that would, and that kind of compensated in some pretty deep way, because I do think art obviously is the one thing that stays. It's what we have as evidence of past civilizations, of, what do we look at of like the previous epochs of human being and behavior. It's mainly art, right? It's like it's the reflection of what it is to be human at that time, and it's a reflection of what it is for the particular artist to have been who he or she was. So I feel like he kind of like balanced out the frenetic, nervous energy that he had in his body, and made these and the impermanence of his body, and made these as permanent as could be, as you say, pieces to kind of like be his projection or his shadow. That's sort of one way I've kind of been trying to cope with it and make sense of it, but I don't think that it's all feeble attempts. I don't think one can ultimately make sense of it. In a way, if you did, it would dismiss it in a way.
I know you've said about the pool out in the desert that you expect it to last 500 years, right? Or like something like that. But I kind of like now, or have you reassessed now that, Shig's piece is right next to it and seems almost equally permanent? Like, what if just those are the two things that are left 500 years from now,
Yeah, I mean, there's always people talk about art as a way to achieve some sort of immortality. And I think Woody Allen joked, I don't want to achieve immortality through my work. I want to achieve it through not dying.
Yes.
And but we've been talking about ways of preserving ourselves through this. I've had the luck of spending this weekend with people who I cherish and adore, dear friends. And one of the topics of conversation has been, is it possible to preserve some aspect of ourselves in a meaningful way after we're gone?
Yeah.
Our other neuroscientist friend, Aaron, who just left, he's very, I wouldn't say pessimistic, because he thinks he has no desire to preserve, unlike us artists. Do you want to preserve yourself somehow after you're gone?
I think if some of my writing lasted, that'd be the only possible way that I would want that to happen. But no, I have no. So like I love and get the greatest joy out of kind of stepping back and observing just things unfold. And I noticed actually, Aaron's answer was very similar, where Aaron was like, if I just had I don't care if I'm a brain in a jar, but as long as I had a Twitter feed, just kind of like vaguely in a compressed way telling me what was going on in the world, that would be enough to satisfy my like immortality, or the need for knowledge about the world rather than actually living or experiencing it. Do you though, like, so this is a weird question. I don't know if this is too quick, too much, but like, it's like a 1-2 punch. These things happened effectively at the same time.
Yeah.
They were within the month, which emotionally probably feels just simultaneous, because that month of this prolonged unknown of the disappearance is still today, right? Like it's still ongoing. So just as a more like, what is the difference between kind of losing a friend where you don't know what happened versus losing a friend where you know exactly what happened? Like, is there an actual emotional difference with that closure? So rarely do you hear of this kind of scenario where, you know, you kind of can almost, you're having these things happen at the same time. And
yeah, to be able to compare them is a really interesting. I had with Elle, who was the girl who disappeared, a lot of people say they want closure, and I've never quite understood that. Especially in the context of like people being punished. Often you hear this, like someone getting the electric chair for murder or something. Somehow there's a sense that's the narrative that's often discussed, that the family of the victim somehow gets closure from killing the killer, and that I've never related to that. And to me, when Elle disappeared, assuming she somehow brilliantly, disguised and made herself unfindable, to me that's a huge favor to those of us left behind, because I don't believe in this closure thing. I think that this little bit of unknown, this etherealness, nature, this vague hope that maybe she left and has started a new life somewhere else, the lack of the just morbid shock of a body, a cadaver, is something that I in a way it helped me cope with that. And I don't know if the 1-2 punch is what made me suffer so much from the second one, or if it was just my relationship with Shig and the fact that we'd known each other a lot longer, and that we had collaborated, and that like I saw and that the daughter, there were so many things about Shig's suicide that were so much more just brutal, a gunshot, self-inflicted gunshot to the head. It's just like, there, and this place that we hung out so much that it's just like that one hit me in a way that even if you described it to me in advance, I don't think I would have predicted how emotionally devastating that would have been. Like, waking up crying in the morning and just like, having trouble. Now it's been a week and I'm able to talk about it, but there was very many times when I was talking about it and not able to just hold back the tears. It's just been like, whoa, like so heavy, and again so difficult to find a comforting narrative around it in any meaningful way, And that's what I think that is so difficult about suicide often.
And I don't know if this is a perfect analog or not, but like I remember this is a decade ago during grad school, so I think this is correct, that this chronic stress literature, where people have just went around and surveyed for decades, like what is the thing that most stresses people out for just a prolonged amount of time. And I believe it's, so that one of the first is having a child like with special needs or disability. It's just a damn stressful chronic thing. But there's a kind of strange paradox about social relations in like the second and third most stressful thing, which is becoming a widow is less stressful than becoming a divorcee, according to this literature. So two people together, when it's a divorce and people still kind of stay simultaneously alive on this mortal coil, it's more stressful than if you actually lose a partner. And the interpretations, of course, of which there are many, but one of them is just simply the kind of certainty of a partner's death versus the ambiguous unknown of they may or may not be out there if a future pandemic happens or if a future good thing happens. The Moon Hotel opens in 2030 and you think to yourself, maybe I could go with them, or maybe they're still there. So you still kind of plan and hope for someone who you don't know for certain is gone. Whereas the certainty of Shig, for example, it brings the odds of you being together ever again or doing anything ever again to zero. Whereas with Elle, it's still non-zero.
Right.
And so there's a way in which, even we're thinking about this kind of like immortality, like how do we preserve, I don't know where it came from, but those sayings that, you die multiple times. The last time you die is when the last person forgets you. And I feel like there's a way in which Elle, like if we just never hear anything ever again, just disappeared, she's going to be on people's minds, and they're going to be planning like, can I get a coffee with Elle? 50 years from now still. Like they'll still be thinking about it. And so it's a very different kind of time or like half-life of relief, as you overcome these things. I don't know. It's not a fun experiment to ask what is the difference, right? But
yeah, I never thought I'd be the one asking. Again, I'm just like, my life has been defined by luck in so many ways, and just kind of, just there's that Paul Simon song, Born at the Right Time, that my mother often says reminds her of me. Like, I've just had this amazing lack of tragedy in my life, I lost my father, but he was 80. And so it was like, that was the closest person to me to die before. And in my way, I spent my whole life preparing for it because he was older. And like, so this type of thing, I'm not equipped for. And I just don't know if anybody can be, really.
Yeah.
You've had experience with suicide as well, right?
Yeah. Well, it's one of the things that I also come back to occasionally when I kind of usually when I have to externally justify to people kind of like, why are you in neuroscience? What are you doing with the brain? Why do you care about the brain? And I kind of have this, at this point, almost stock answer, which is, it's just basically that relative to physics, I don't know why us neuroscientists, we're kind of self-conscious about the success of other scientific disciplines. They've done well. And so like physics can, like just from their tiny little observatory rooms, they're like studying the Big Bang, and they can see like light from behind a black hole, and they can, physicists can land with perfect millimeter precision a autonomous car on the moon or on Mars and all this shit, and they like know exactly where everything is going to go. And it took a while to get there, of course, but they can now. And in neuroscience, we can't even tell you what being sad is, like at all. Right? Like we don't even have a basic definition of these things that are, first of all, driving so much of human behavior, driving so much of the ultimate end of some humans' behaviors, right? And it's on the rise. Like suicide has been on the rise in America since 2000. It's increasing. It's more common. So this is when I say, like, I think neuroscience has failed in some capacity. This is kind of what I mean, which is that, to understand a tiny piece of a brain, which we do very well, is so different than being able to prevent the failure of the whole system, right? I believe that there is no greater failure than when a brain effectively, wants to stop itself. And part of it, I think, is so during graduate school, so I met this woman, and we were very good friends, and we were briefly together, and she was one of the most brilliant people I had ever met. She had this like laser manic creative brilliance to her, where I hadn't met anyone who had met her who was not kind of awed in some way. And
was she also studying neuroscience?
She was a bioengineer.
Mm-hmm.
And took her own life at, I think she was 22 years old.
Well, you were dating her, though?
A couple months after we stopped dating.
How long were you with her?
Maybe like 6 months. Also a couple months. Mm-hmm. And it's like, so, and the thing that so I talked to her very good friend whose response was just, yeah, so Claire had gone home. She had ordered poison off the internet. So it wasn't, like we talk about like gunshots and bridges and these things where it's like impulsive, and there's supposed to be a thing where, if you can intervene somehow in those few seconds of that impulsivity, which is true, I think, in most cases, the person expresses regret, right? Like about the act, or maybe doesn't want to do it. Or if they do, they try again. But
what kind
like
of poison
this was
did she
not,
order?
I believe it was hemlock. So
Wow.
she,
it's like the archetypal. I mean, probably the first
it's
suicide we
literally-
hear about is
Socrates.
Socrates. Yeah.
Yeah, I think. Petronius maybe also. I forget how he died.
That's how they used to do it. So what do you do? Is it a plant?
It's a plant. I deeply looked it up at the time. I didn't know. So that at the time was, and I don't want to make it about me in any sense, but like at the time, that was my first attempt to grieve, like with this kind of loss, and I didn't understand it, and not in a way that I like need to understand other people's behaviors, but what I meant is, it doesn't feel real for a very long time. Or it just didn't feel real to me for a very long time. In part, I think it's like this failure of induction. So the sun goes down and it seems to rise every single day. Like without fail, across the history of humanity, the sun has gone down and it has gone up. And so by induction, it's probably going to do so again tomorrow. And I feel like suicide is this strange failure of induction on those around the person who ultimately did it, in the sense that, so it's common to describe it as it spreads. So there's this saying in kind of mental health and community mental health that suicide is contagious. This happens a lot. And I think in part,
in the sense that people, once they hear that it's a possibility, other people start doing it more.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, a friend of ours wrote that she was jealous.
Yeah.
Was her first reaction when she heard about Shig.
It can spread, and it can spread because it can also be somewhat like surprising that someone who you from the outside perceived as successful, artistic, happy, or whatever the qualities you see in that other person, like if they could do it, I could do it. Or if they could do it, like, oh, there's maybe a reasonable justification too. But I also feel there's something like slightly more insidious about the inductive failure of it. And what I mean by that is every single friend you've had, and also you yourself, you're there every day. Like every day you've known this person, they're there in some sense. They've been alive every day. So I really feel like every single time a person just is no longer there, like it's as big a violation as if the sun decided to not come out one day. Mm-hmm. And it just makes no sense for a while. You're like, what do you mean they're not there?
Yeah.
That's not possible, because they've been there every day. So why is today different? It doesn't feel different. You know, everything else about life, no one seems to notice. Like, you know, the world goes on, but for some reason the sun did not rise that day. And it's a strange violation in like the continuity of identity and life and all these things. So Claire, ended up dying by suicide right around kind of Christmas time, the week between like Christmas and New Year's. And I had heard, so I care about this in the mental health world. Like I consider it to be like a huge, big failure. I'm not an activist by any means, but the one thing I like truly, truly will care about, and is a first principle thing, is like, we need to get better at this particular thing. People should not be doing this. And so one of the strange pieces of data about suicide, because of course people study this, right? And neuroscientists, because most of our tools can't get too far into like these kinds of reasons. So we have to look at all kinds of other stuff like behavior, like, you know, did they increase their typing speed in the days before, and crap like that, right? Uh-huh. We're looking for proxies. We're looking for secondary clues. And there's a study, I think 2003, this guy, Pennebaker, up in Canada, a psychologist, I believe. Anyway, looked at poets. So for some reason, poets, they have this kind of classic association with suicide and death, right? There's certain kinds of arts that seem to lend themselves to certain kinds of suffering. And there's a study looking at the published poetry, the published words of, I think maybe like 12 poets who ultimately ended up committing suicide, and then 12 who didn't. And they basically like blended up all of the published works and tried to determine, is there a word, is there a theme, is there a phrase that is more likely to occur in the published poetry of those who did or did not end up ending their own life. And they found that in the group that had ultimately at some point in the future committed suicide, they were more likely to use the word I. First person reference is I. And this has been interpreted as kind of this isn't narcissism, this isn't egotism. This is a disconnect between the body and self and the rest of the world.
That's a good way to think about it. Yeah.
Right. It's not selfishness at all. It's.
I mean, maybe the two aren't as different as you think.
They might not be. But I guess I would say it's like it feels pathological in a different direction. Like it's about alienation from, it's about disconnection from other people, not about an obsession with self.
I've noticed a lot of people defensive, what feels to me defensive reaction, but it's also understandable and rational, which is to be angry with the person, right?
Yeah.
To say, how could you absolve yourself of responsibility? In the Shig's case, especially with leaving behind a daughter, you know? And I think that represents a failure to see the extent to which suicide is a rejection of all of the values that the world has given. It's a negation. It presupposes that the sense of responsibility is still active in some way.
Yeah.
And it just isn't. When you've made that choice, you're rejecting all the world, including all of these dichotomies of responsible or irresponsible, and I disagree that people shouldn't be able to do this, because I think philosophically it makes sense that it's an option, because we weren't given the option to be here. We didn't choose who we are. We didn't choose our circumstances that we're born into. And this idea that we can like say no thank you is deeply fair in a way.
Yeah.
I mean, at the same time, you know, obviously on an emotional level, trying to put yourself in the mindset of somebody who would do this to a little kid that was the person they love the most in the world.
Yeah.
That is very hard to, I mean, I get like chills just thinking about the depths of sadness and despair that you have to be in to do this. But at the same time, I think you're not doing it anymore to somebody, because you're negating the world in the most absolute way that you could possibly imagine. And I think people underestimate that when they still use worldly value systems to judge what the person did. I think it's a philosophical mistake.
Yeah, so I kind of backed into that statement of, you know, this shouldn't be happening. And what I mean by that is, so I think we agree on, like, a person should be able to they should be able to do, if they want to end their life, they should be able to. The problem is, the way that I see it is that there are some subset of people who maybe just want to, and it's a reasonable conclusion. Like, I actually believe that Claire, the act of ordering the poison, waiting for it to arrive, like by post, you know, and then taking it once it arrived, which is my understanding of the sequence of events. To me, that's like, okay, that person wanted to. As in, that was a plan, and it was a plan that they completed. And the problem to me is that I believe there are some subset of people for whom, for whatever reason, it could be a breakup, it could be local grief, it could be some kind of thing that is coloring their desire to do so in the immediate moment.
Right.
And so just, if that is true, what I'm saying about what I want neuroscience to be able to do is kind of intervene for those that willingly would like intervention. Right. People saying, I'm having these thoughts and I don't want to be having them. For those people, I would like to be able to help in some way. And I don't think there is a way. And so...
You don't think there's any way to help people?
Well, no, I think there's a million ways. But I mean, I don't think there's a way that neuroscience helps. There's no therapy, social support, and it's socioeconomic at this point. Like, that's how to help. Or like social, it's social. I don't know that...
I'm sure antidepressants have stopped a million suicides now.
But they've caused a bunch too. And I'm by no means like anti-psychiatry whatsoever, but like the withdrawal from, either becoming tolerant to one SSRI or trying to get off some. Like suicidal behavior goes up after people stop taking a lot of these.
Right.
And who knows what that means, but it's like, if you stop taking Advil and your headache gets worse, it doesn't mean that the Advil was preventing the suicide or preventing the headache. So people, it's not the case that there's a pill to stop those feelings and that people are just not taking the pill. And so I think that when you have a group of people, let's say it's 1 million people a year around the world, I end up doing this. I don't know the actual statistics, but it's going up. It's way the fuck higher than it should be or we want to be. And when I say should, I just mean I think there's a subset of them which don't want to.
Yeah.
And
I accept that.
And then I don't know how to differentiate the two. And so that's what I meant. I back into this because without the ability to differentiate the two, I would rather, as a blanket statement, say, all right, well, sorry, we're going to do a top-down intervention and prevent this from happening to all of you, because I don't know how to differentiate between those that are just in acute grief or those that want to.
Yeah. And of course, both of these happened, we should say, at the tail end of this COVID pandemic, which I see them in part as casualties of the pandemic too.
Yeah,
because
fair.
I don't think that, the weight that this thing took in very individual ways, but across the board, is just enormous. Whether it's people losing their jobs, whether people are losing touch with their family and unable to see them, unable to travel the way they used to. And, in Shig's case, it got into this kind of paranoia about the government doing this to us and all sorts of, theories that, I think personally are quite outlandish, but, people have become quite convinced, which is just definitely not helping. And there's just been a failure on so many levels in terms of community, in terms of science and politics coming together to meet a crisis in a way that feels like it has, we say what you will about 9/11 or any other kind of group, the tragedy that our country has been through. I always felt this sense of shared communal grieving and we're going to do this together. Even me being not at all patriotic, I felt that. And with COVID, it was the opposite for some reason. It was just it just sowed division and everything, things that we don't think of as political became political, and it just really fucked with us in the worst way. And the fact that I lost 2 friends right at the end of it is just, to me, the evidence of that in the worst way.
There's this bizarre, it's not a theory in again, the study of suicide, but just a kind of strange observation that, again, people have a bunch of potential explanations for, but nobody knows really what's going on. There's some obvious ones, but basically during unit-wide trauma, and so when I say unit, I mean it can be like a town or a country. I don't know, it doesn't seem to get bigger than a country, but maybe it could. If the whole town is attacked at once, if the whole country is attacked at once. So this was during the bombings during World War II, probably in Rashomon also, or not Rashomon, the one with the town. They have to defend the town. Suicides drop sometimes to 0. People in shared trauma during the events, during the London bombing, it dropped to 0. And it's not a reporting bias, as far as anyone can tell. It's not just because people stopped paying attention or collecting the statistics. It just seems to drop to 0
because people stop saying I all the time. Became we, probably.
It becomes we, and it becomes but there's also something very, and I say flattening in an almost positive way, about the emotional turmoil and distance between you and your neighbor. So I can only speak to this personally, but when I feel personally at my loneliness or probably saddest, I feel farthest from my neighbors. I feel farthest from those closest to me. Just, not in a real physical space, but just figuratively. I could be next to them, but I still feel far away. And the kind of joint shared trauma of all of us being attacked at once and all of us just having to survive. And if you survive, just surviving is an achievement. If you're ever there, suicide just doesn't come up. You know, it doesn't become. It's almost like a luxury option in this strange way. You know, like life of Pi, that thing. You know, figuratively, metaphorically, truthfully, it doesn't matter. Trapped on a little raft, right? Like a human trapped in a raft with some animals. The animals aren't going to commit suicide, no matter how bad it gets out there. They never reach that point where they give up. But half of the survival manual for what to do if you're adrift at sea is the psychological preparation for, okay, don't get lost, don't go mad, you know, don't do self-harm, like just try to survive. Like, it's as if we have to spend half of our survival manuals being like, okay, just if things get bad, revert back to animal instincts and just try to just go one step at a time, make it to the watering hole, you know, make it to tomorrow. And it's like almost shocking the degree to which that kind of thinking has to come out of us. The basic just animal, like, just keep going. Just like, yes, it's bad, but just keep going.
So what was it about COVID, do you think, that was divisive instead of uniting?
I think there were aspects that were extremely uniting. I like, in a sense that I think a lot of people became poor instantly by a broad definition of poverty, where suddenly you couldn't take flights, which has always been out of reach for those in the very low classes or just lower class. So I think there was like almost flattening of, like, you know, Tom Hanks got the thing. So, oh my God, a celebrity can get it and just a person can get it. You know, like, you know, this was all of us at once. You know, the president can get it of Britain and the US. Celebrity can get it. Your neighbor can get it. It didn't matter how rich or not rich you were. You were able to buffer by, like, maybe having your own house. But there was a
having better medical care
and having access to medical care, that kind of stuff. But I think the isolation was maybe people, you know, realized what did and did not mean something to them. Like, what mattered, how many people reached out to them during the pandemic. Did their friends answer their calls? And whereas before you could always kind of give an excuse of, oh, that person's not visiting me because X, that person's not reaching out because of Y. Maybe just for some people, they realized that nobody's reaching out. People don't, you know, I suddenly, in this experimental condition, made it's clear to me now that I'm more alone. That for some reason, the groups of people that I depended on anchored and hunkered down on different things that weren't me.
I don't know. I'm thinking about this while you're speaking, and I do think there were things that made it so just intrinsically and fundamentally divisive, in the sense that I do think it hit people so unevenly, right? It depended on so much on social class, and, you know, people of color and people with less money were disproportionately getting sick from, you know, conditions that are closer together. People who were had the means were able to isolate with their savings accounts and their houses and their little bubbles of families. Yeah. It didn't level differences in a meaningful enough way in terms of, if you're young and healthy, it didn't hit you as hard. I think it also exposed the elitism and protectiveness of even those of us who consider ourselves most progressive. I saw people who were coming from the kind of coastal liberal elite places that, you know, everybody in the middle of America kind of feels alienated from, appear in the desert, because my home became an escape for a lot of people. Like my Airbnb doubled during COVID. And so I got to kind of see the differences in the way people behaved. And I definitely felt that people who came from, San Francisco and, and tech and all of this, on the one hand, it seemed like a rational understanding of the way the virus works, and they had a certain level of education about it. And but I also have to be honest and say, I could feel a certain defaulting to detachment from others that felt to me like, there's like the paranoia of the William Randolph Hearst, like becoming a germaphobe, right? And I felt that in some way from people who were used to controlling everything and wanting to continue to control everything, and therefore not putting themselves at any risk, right? Whereas I felt like people who were a little more prioritizing of human touch and contact, saying, okay, look, I know this is a risk, but I'm willing to take that risk to give you a handshake or something like that. Right. So I found myself very much on the fence politically on this, and sympathetic to both sides, not sympathetic to the paranoid conspiratorial theories. I thought those were counterproductive and actually, deeply harmful. And I still think that about the vaccine. I think it's really hurting people. But at the same time, I found myself being in the desert and having this kind of sympathy for this kind of exposure to all sorts of viewpoints that the rest of the country is living in their little bubbles. I felt why that divisiveness happened, and why maybe the increase in the I also, and I think this and you think that, and it kind of fits that the suicide would go up, I think.
Well, so one observation, and then one, like, I think I see what you're doing. So the observation, like, it may or may not have, the causality is hard, right? And especially when you encounter something you don't understand, when you encounter someone who the sun didn't rise for them, and it doesn't make sense, and you're grasping for some sort of meaning or explanation or why. You try to find the why, right? You try to find, okay, I know that right before the trigger was pulled, some acetylcholine flooded the receptor between the motor neuron that came down from the brain and the trigger finger. Okay, was it the acetylcholine's fault? No. Okay, right before that, what happened? Was it some supplementary motor cortex area which started to send out that neurotransmitter to cause the muscle to contract, which causes the trigger to be pulled, which causes the bullet to leave? No, it's not that chunk of brain matter's fault either. And then you keep going back and you keep saying, okay, well, now what is it? And there's this desperate need to ask why and to try to fill it in with plausible explanations immediately. And so the plausible explanation of, well, this did seem to happen immediately after a year of some of the most isolating, hardest, just devastating, strange, unknown and ambiguous world, changing event. But also maybe they had always wanted to, or maybe, do you trace that causality back to the journal entry, which of L's, which we know happened before the pandemic. So, it makes sense to take the big, what appears to be the big billiard and ball in the room, which is the causal thing, which is shaping so much, and say, oh, well, that also explains these two people's behavior. But it's been maybe a decade or so since Claire. Since I knew Claire, or since the language just fails at every fucking attempt to try to describe the verb tense, but whatever. It's been about a decade, and just the why is not helpful. That's the hardest thing for at least my realization is I desperately seek whys. I desperately seek causes in my day, in my life, in my scientific pursuits, and just in the way that I like to like interact with the world. But I just can't go down the why path with Claire, with this reason, because I don't know what to do. I don't know what to trust, and I'm almost afraid of settling on the wrong reason, or even just settling on this idea that reasons don't matter, or I'm like afraid of every possible outcome if I keep going on that attempt. But I of course blame myself, right? I of course in some capacity think to myself, oh my God, I should have done something different in those months, or and so but the causality just doesn't work here. It's a weird thing. That, just to tie it back briefly to the immortality thing we were talking about earlier. Do you know the Alcor, that preservation company, the company that
the cryogenics?
The cryogenics, yeah, they like freeze you. I went to a board meeting of theirs once, like as a total interloper. Like I did not know these were not open to the public. I had just seen the details online. And I went, and it was just kind of a group of maybe like 6 people sitting in a circle who were very bothered by this interloper. They're like, who are you? What are you doing here? Like, do you want to sign up for this thing? Or do you want to help us run the company from the inside? Because this is a board meeting. That's what we're doing here. And
you crashed an Alcor
I crashed an
board
Alcor board meeting because it was happening right outside Stanford campus. It was just in Palo Alto. And I was like, well, yeah, I'll just go see what happens. And so it's a group of people sitting in a circle, and there was one woman who was kind of detached in the back, like reading a book or on her phone, or like she just wasn't paying attention. And they kind of went around the circle to kind of give me an introduction to themselves, and all of them had signed up for Alcor. So what it is it's a life insurance thing that you pay monthly dues, or maybe yearly lifelong dues, literally. And they will then guarantee that they will preserve either your head or body in Arizona.
Either your head alone or your head and body together.
Yeah, either your head alone or your head plus body at different price tiers. It's like an iPhone. Do you want the 12 X or and so everyone at the meeting, of course, at the board, they all signed up for this. They all believed that, almost like Egyptian pharaohs, right? They believe that like there is a process of embalming, it's just embalming. It's just it's modern mummification, but they believe that there's a process of embalming that maybe at some point in the future some technology or society will be able to bring them back. And I think it's the difference. It's kind of what I was saying earlier about the certainty versus the tiniest bit of chance above zero. It's like, okay, well, if you die and don't do this, the odds are 0 you're coming back, unless you're religious, but the odds are 0. Sorry. And but the alternative is, what if there's this like 0.01% chance? Because you're multiplying that expected value of it working by like infinity. You get to resurrect. You get to, your Cylon battleship will you'll wake up on your Cylon ship. And so what was so fascinating to me though was that this one woman in the back, her husband was on the board, but she was kind of creeped out by the idea and did not sign up for the life insurance company. And so they said that they treat people who refuse to sign up, have not signed up, and will not sign up as having committed suicide. So they legitimately believed that the wife, by choosing not to sign up, had already committed suicide, and that I was effectively just engaging in suicidal behavior by not signing up for this thing, because you have a chance at immortality. So the concept of accepting that you'll just die, you'll just kind of go into the night and you won't put up a fight at all, to them is completely irrational. And it was just such a bizarre kind of logic to me that it's kind of fascinating. And maybe it's just like they felt almost like it was kind of a science-based religious ethos, right? Like they're believing in some sort of heaven, they're believing in some sort of immortality, and they're saying, if you're not choosing to, almost like the way that Mormons would be like, if you're not choosing to have your seat in heaven, It's a failure of your own. Why would you not want to live forever? But even just secular non-believers in a God can still engage in this. It's delusional, but I believe it's delusional. But
I was arguing with Aaron about this. I think that all the science, as far as I understand it, points to the idea that that's delusional, and I agree with that. I think it's more likely that some future civilization will be able to bring us back based on other types of forensic evidence that we leave. Right. And I was saying, and being laughed off by our other neuroscience professor friend. So maybe I'm just as delusional as these folks, but I think that the mixture of all of these videos and photos and DNA and all of the unknown things that we're leaving behind, traces that we're leaving behind by our phones that track us and the way we read and the way we, just a Tinder profile that someone asked for Tinder to give them the data they have on them. And it was like 600 pages of data.
They keep like, not Tinder specifically, but some of these tech companies have kept mouse movements going back to like 2005.
Yeah, that's incredible. And I feel
if you go to their website, they're keeping your mouse movements all in perpetuity, every single like micro move.
And I liken it to people, they just recreated a Modigliani painting that was based on X-rays of the painting. He had painted over a portrait of a woman that he'd broken up with. Did you hear about this?
No.
So, great Italian painter from the 1920s, I think, Amedeo Modigliani. He had painted this woman, and then he broke up with her. She broke his heart, so he painted over the portrait. So now they recreated the painting, right? Mm-hmm. Based on X-rays, both based on analysis of the brush strokes, based on like the analysis of the pigments that he used, the canvas, and all this stuff. I don't think there's any way that he could have thought that would be a possibility 100 years later.
No. Like that was a permanent removal.
Right. That was
at the time.
So to me, when the neuroscientist of today says, no, there's absolutely no way, to me, it feels like it's a failure of imagination of the types of advances. And theoretically, I feel like there is the possibility that a future civilization would be able to recreate all of the past just based on present conditions. Like maybe we will understand causation so much better than we do now that we will be able to recreate Patrick just based on the formation of the universe the way it is in 100,000, 1,000,000, 1,000,000,000 years or something like that, right? So my sense is that we should. I'm just naturally an archivist and a documenter. So it's like, that's why I'm constantly, I've kept over 1 million photos from the last, 20 years since they've been digital. And I just like the idea of collecting and documenting. And I'm grateful to the people who did that in the past, in whichever way they did it, whether they were writers or painters or, pharaohs, in Egypt. And so I guess as an artist and as a documenter, I do have this quasi-religious belief in some sense of immortality, that we may wake up again one day, and it might be based on what we think of as incidental data. Maybe it's the way we move that mouse will be enough, and all the rest won't matter. The frozen body, none of that will be necessary. But if you have those mouse clicks, 10 years of mouse clicks will be enough to individuate what it was like to be you. So I think everyone who wants to maybe should actually collect that data and bring it all in together in one place. In fact, somebody should start a company that does that.
Yeah, I mean, even just like being a serial killer in the 70s, you thought you were worried about leaving fingerprints, because there was just no forensic ability to track, everything you could possibly leave. Like hairs didn't matter, DNA didn't matter, so many things, and just decades later, now, probably some of those people that haven't been caught, like probably a little bit worried, and that you just had no concept of what to look out for, what to know that future technologies would be able to do. And it seemed like tiny little recordings, like audio recordings, a half hour of conversation from left on a phone message from the 40s, like 1940s, let's just imagine. You take that today and you can do like all kinds of AI derived analyses on probably maybe the person's mood or their accent. They could, even if, or maybe even their identity, maybe their speech is actually related in some way to the shape of their jaw, which you can actually infer, therefore, their family or ancestry. Maybe you could actually de-anonymize an old clip just based on some PhD right now making a model of, can you go from jaw shape to sounds? I think there's probably people that have never met us that have only listened to this podcast. Let's say there's a person out there that has never met us, only listens to this, but now there's enough data that you could absolutely make a deep fake about you with your and I voice.
Yep.
And probably the semantic content. I don't know if we're that surprising. We try to be. And then what if that person just hears another one and we, being in the world just continues as a podcast without us being alive?
And then it brings
that
up
person, we're effectively immortal, right?
Yeah, and so there was a film of Kieslowski, the great Polish director who made Red, White, and Blue and the Decalogue, and he was reflecting on his early filmmaking days, and I think, or maybe had made a documentary early on. But anyway, he had this 60mm camera, and he's in this poor little suburb of Warsaw, and he filmed this woman. And then she died, and her son came and said, was watching this, grainy black and white silent footage and saying, "You've made my mother immortal." And that was enough, right? So if we keep moving the goalpost as what counts as immortality, there's this amazing film of Marlon Brando. He made hundreds of hours of recordings of himself. And then he scanned his head in the 90s. And then the state gave these tapes and computer files to these documentary filmmakers, and they recreated his life story based on, these kind of rambling monologues that he did, plus his biography that we're aware of. And it's just a profoundly moving piece that, in a way, is a sort of immortality. And then, we were arguing the other day. Well, Aaron was saying, well, it's so much more to be you than that, and I was like, well, I don't know what it is to be me. It could be enough just to have a few memories and then just this feeling of being me that is made evident by, what my body is made, looks like on the outside. Maybe you can infer what it feels like to be this type of body. And maybe just, I don't need to remember everything that happened in my life in order to be me. In fact, we don't. We
naturally don't. And if there's huge gaps, we just fill them in. It doesn't really seem...
And then I'm sure that there's a million ways to improve that I would not be mad at. I mean, there's imagine if I had a memory that actually did remember all the things that I experienced based on what my phone has recorded and, the videos and photos I've taken. That might be even more me than I am now.
I mean, do you think the act of committing suicide is actually the opposite? So there's a few classic responses to either to knowing someone or having someone close to you who does this. One of them is an inevitable conversation about immortality and mortality.
Right.
Do you think suicide is the opposite of wanting to be immortal? Because there's a weird sense in which some of the darkest people I know who don't really seem to enjoy the present or life, they're just kind of doing it. One foot after the next, would live forever. They find this interesting. They find this whole thing interesting, but aren't necessarily enjoying the ride, but wouldn't get off. And so I feel like there's some conflation or confusion, and they don't seem to be there's not a straight line where immortality and suicide are on either ends. There's some sort of weird inversion or twisted knot in there of perhaps even both wanting to commit suicide and be immortal. And it just, so when you do something like scrape through someone's published works or these kind of academic searches for why or causes, the premise is always that that eventually all of this led up until the suicide. So you tend to think that everything was evidence for it. But it's really hard to realize that along the way there were a lot of things that maybe prolonged it, right? That like maybe it was supposed to, in air quotes, happen sooner, but so many good things impinged, or so many, but people rarely consider that when they're going through the stages of grief of, oh my God, why didn't I reach out? Why didn't I do something different? I literally could have picked up the phone, or I could have traveled.
There's so much of that. And I keep having to remind myself and others that we have this tendency to always think in hypotheticals of like things could have been different. But, you know, the reality is things never have turned out differently than they did. So why would they have in this case? Like,
Yeah.
It seems like, you know, obviously we have there's a reason we think in these hypotheticals, but there's certain, we have to accept in some deep way, as important as the ability to make hypotheticals has to be an ability to accept things turning out the way they actually do, and realizing that probably there was no alternative. But to me, like I used to think about, I wonder what percentage of the population thinks about the possibility of suicide. I'm a very happy person, one of the happiest people I know, and I've thought about it countless times, especially in my early 20s when I had I used to get panic attacks, and I used to be real hypochondriac, so I would worry about having some fatal disease, and then go off on these kind of daydreams of like, how would I end it most painlessly and without leaving behind some sort of gruesome scene. And I think it's comforting in a way to be able to have that as a possibility. Do you?
Well, I think it's interesting to think about whether or not like thinking about it is a kind of inoculation against it, or if it makes it more likely for you to do it. There's like kind of different camps, right? Because you could imagine that in one version. So I think like Japanese samurais used to do this, where they were even while sitting not on the battlefield, one of their training was psychological training, where they were supposed to just like sit quietly in a room, close their eyes, and imagine the worst things that could happen on the battlefield. Like you're about to enter into a sword fight. Just go through all of it. Go through the worst thing that could happen. How would you react if you got your leg chopped off? Like, what would you really do? And so but the imagination exercises, their theory was that it makes you more prepared for when and if that thing does happen. So I could imagine that if we believe that like suicidality is some of the time a very local and impulsive thing, like a breakup or a moment of acute grief, and it's only going to last a little while. Is it useful to have prepared yourself by pre-imagining these, such that when it does happen, when the acute trauma does happen, and then you think to yourself, I'm suddenly considering suicide, you don't think to yourself, I've never had this thought before, therefore it must be real and valid this time, because it's the first and only. If you had kind of, in a sense, practiced against inoculation against these intrusive thoughts or whatever, or reasonable thoughts, who knows. And then the other one is kind of that like video game causes violence kind of theory, which would be having a plan makes you more likely to go through with that plan. I don't know, but I mean, I've definitely been in places. The way that I describe it to myself is, if I've been in places where I could imagine thinking that was the right thing to do. Like I've never been where I think it's the right thing to do, but I've been in enough pain that I could imagine that it might be the right thing to do.
Yeah.
I've been in enough pain that I could understand why suicide for some reason seems to be contagious. There's the Anthony Bourdain documentary that just came out, Roadrunner. And of course it ends with his death by suicide. And it just seems clear, almost like evident internally within the logic of just the movie itself, why these things are contagious. It's because so many people respected Anthony Bourdain. When he killed himself, what do you do with that respect? Do you want to do this? If people you respect can do this, why can't you? And it's this weird it's just weird how that logic works. But so, for example, I ended up with Claire. I ended up taking everything she had written me and everything I could find that was written about her with the impetus from this poetry suicide study. And I ran a word frequency analysis. I did the same thing, right, that they did in the paper. I looked in their methods, found the stats package they used, and I did that on everything Claire had ever written. And front and center, I did the word cloud thing, and the most common word was I. And so then the question is, I'm a scientist, so what do you do with that? Is it, oh, well, she and I mostly G-chatted and text messaged, so it's more, it's different than poetry itself, which is a published piece of art.
Did you count your own words? Was it most frequent with you too?
I did not count my own words.
Oh,
this is where, no, I know exactly. So this was funny, is I was in grad school at the time, and my advisor actually knew her because she had been an undergrad and master's student at Stanford. And I hate the fucking verbs that we have to use. I hate saying had been. I hate saying knew instead of I know her. I hate saying knew her. I fucking hate that. But anyway, I took this data and presented it basically to my advisor, and his first response, which is the correct one, was, "What's your control?" Right? It was, well, so what I would have had to do was take other people I knew or dated and do a word frequency on their clouds, and this was as close as I've ever been to I didn't believe that there were questions that should exist outside of science. I kind of had just always, it didn't even seem a matter of opinion or belief to me that, to me, of course, everything is under the jurisdiction of science. But when he said, what's your control? My just visceral response was fuck your methods, fuck your control. This does not need a control. There are some things that don't need to be talked about like that.
So coldly and detachedly.
Yeah, but of course it's right, but also it's not. And also, I remember one ex-girlfriend of mine who, she was in her 20s, but she had a will. And I was
Wow.
and I just, there was nothing, it wasn't a chronic disease or anything. She's just it's reasonable, that's something you do. It's so much easier for your family if you do happen to die in an accident, which is very true. But my response was, yes, that is true. Yes, that is rational. Yes, you help people, but we do not talk about that. It creeped me out that she had a will. And because if she had died, I didn't want to consider those things. I didn't care about the material aspects of the legal consequences. And so it felt kind of similar in the sense that I felt like these things should be, in that moment, I felt the will was outside of reason. She was being reasonable, but it felt like some things just shouldn't be reasonable. And this kind of word frequency felt similar.
Well, if you want things not to be reasonable, the suicide definitely presents that in so many ways. That's been one of the hardest things about dealing with this, is just how profoundly unreasonable it is.
Yeah.
And how hard it is to make sense of, how hard it is to process. And again, I said this in passing before, but I think that if there's a reason it defies reason, because if it were able to be too reasoned about, it would banalize it. It would trivialize it. Yeah. Maybe you're right that certain things should be beyond our ability to put them in a box, and this feels like that. And maybe we can find some comfort in knowing some things we won't ever understand. It's probably a good place to stop.
I remember. Can I tell one more?
Yes, of course. Let me see why this happened.
Yeah. Well, because I just had a moment where I remembered I just want to talk about it. I've never talked about it. It was around New Year's when I found out about Claire, and I was in a cabin out in the snow, and I had basically gone out to the highway just to check. I think I was on Facebook at the time. I just was addicted to something. I wanted to go check in on the internet, and so I in this gorgeous kind of wintry scene, go out, check check on the internet, find out she's dead. Find out from her friends that she had ordered the poison, had taken it, and that the friend said has always been very sad. And there's a thing that so her sister, she had one sister, and her sister had died of a surprise congenital heart defect as a teenager. And Claire this was deeply, deeply affecting to Claire. She thought about it every day. She missed her sister. She hated the randomness by which this, like a hole in a tiny, stupid hole in a heart, had just removed this person from the planet. And it was such a physical cause, right? Like, so like in the search for causes of someone's death, this was like so clearly there was a hole in their heart. It was there since she was born. Nobody's at fault. This is a fluke of goddamn nature. And then she just died. So like you can trace that causality, and there's so much like you don't regret, like not checking in on that person. You just kind of just have to deal with it. And so then years later, Claire kills herself. And the question to me is kind of
parents.
Oh my God, yeah. As the only two kids, it is fucking awful. So then, but my question, and I think about this often, which is like, how different are their deaths? So like, is that, causally, some thought caused it in the same way that a hole in the heart, like, do we think about sadness as like a tiny hole in the heart that's leaking? Is it that simple? Is there a metaphor there? Is there anything? And, because it is a physical thing, right? Like maybe some of these mental illnesses, like true depression, or maybe just sadness itself, I don't know. But like maybe there's a physical way to describe that. Yeah. No different than the hole in the heart. But one death is so easy to understand, and another death is so hard to understand. And so I didn't want to like bum everyone out. It was New Year's at this cabin. I had gone out to the street, checked my phone, been like, holy shit, weeped. Like wiped away the tears. It'd been like, okay, I'm not going to go back and it just kind of, I didn't want to, maybe it is shock. Who the hell knows? I just didn't mention it. But so the whole group went for a hike, and I was like, nah, I'm going to stay behind. I just, need to do some things. And there was a typewriter, and there was no paper. So there's no paper in the entire cabin, but there's this old kind of vintage antique typewriter. And there were dryer sheets. So dryer sheets have this very, very strange parchment quality to them, where they're actually they're quite thick. They're quite cloth-like. And they look like a nice old weathered piece of paper. And so I actually put that in the typewriter, and I started typing on it. And the letter O, right? Because typewriters are physical. The letter O would punch through the dryer sheet such that it actually made a hole in the dryer sheet. And I loved the kind of aesthetic of this dryer sheet, which had my musings, where I literally just like got it all out. I wrote a short story about Claire. I wrote this thing about like what happens to a body when it dies, and how much, like I did the math on, how quickly do you lose your temperature when you die? And it's about like 1.5 degrees an hour. Like when a body dies, it settles back to room temperature, because you're no longer fighting the ambient temperature of the room. That's what living is. All living is you're just fighting the ambient temperature of the room. So, but when you die, you go back to the room temperature. And so I typed this, whatever it was. And then the final sheet had these holes in it. And when the person who owned the cabin came back, who owned the typewriter also, he was just like, he looked at the thing, right? And I was proud of it. And I was like, look, I typed a short story on this neat little piece of paper. And he looked at it, and his first thought was like, where did the little holes go? He was worried that they would be stuck in the typewriter. Mm-hmm. And I So first of all, it was like obvious to me, like the tiny little hole in the heart was a clear parallel. Like he was bothered by the holes in this parchment, and I, was thinking deeply about the difference between Claire and her sister dying with the hole in the heart. But just this idea of like you end up with this thing, and some of it is missing, and you don't know where it goes. And I don't know. Like I couldn't explain it other than it felt like dying was almost punching a hole through like you lose that little piece.
Yeah.
You lose that little piece of the paper and it doesn't come back. I don't know. I don't have closure on my story, but it like something's there. Maybe I just haven't figured out yet what that moment was about, but it struck me. And, and I think the larger picture is just like everyone has different ways of grieving. Like, I don't know how you have now, or if you're going to do anything, but it's just so different and hard.
I do think there's some comfort to be found in the fact that we don't mind the fact that we can't be in two places at once, but we want to be in all times. But there's a deep truth that's consistent with our scientific understanding of the world, which is that if you existed at some time, then you always will have existed in that time. And we are just like you're located in one place, you're located in one period of time, and that's okay. That's depending, obviously, if you think of this like the block universe, or if you think that the current moment has more importance than the rest, like obviously there's deep scientific and philosophical debate about this, but I do think that the person having existed is a miracle in and of itself, and obviously there, and also the fact that we grieve so hard is evidence of the uniqueness of and sanctity of a human life. I've been amazed with the Elle situation at how much effort is put into institutions and people all coming together to try and solve this. You know what I mean?
Because people tried to find her, like helicopters and dogs and search teams and police.
And there's warrants were executed and it's incredible how much we value a life. You could easily imagine a world in which when people disappeared, would people be like, oh well, you know what I mean? Like I'm always amazed by the level of compassion and importance that people place on a human life, on all lives, and it points to even within a secular realm, how there is this still a sense of the sacred, right. and that if anything counts as sacred, a human life does, and the fact that we feel such an immense loss when we lose somebody is an acknowledgement of the uniqueness of that person, right?
Which we, for self-conscious or silly social reasons, like fail to usually get across to that person. The amount and extent of our love or interest in a person, we kind of just assume they know it, and then once they're gone, just waves of like, oh my God, did they know how much I appreciated their closeness to me or existence or what I drew from them? It's
but even that is not an easy it's easy to think oh, we should all just be expressing all our love all the time, but the opposite can also be equally overwhelming or suffocating if someone's telling you too much that they love you and like okay, back off.
Well, but
you know what I mean?
It's just hard,
especially someone like Shigley who was so prickly as a character. I can't imagine what he would have just told everyone to go fuck themselves if they started telling them they love them too much. I don't know. It's just like...
No, the solution is certainly not just oversharing. But, well, I guess it's more just in the mobilization of physical, literal resources to find someone who's physically, literally missing versus, this might be a little cute, but there are people that are lost. That are right next to you, that are sitting in Starbucks or somewhere, and we don't send search teams for them, right? Like there's someone 2 days before they end their own life, that person is lost, but we don't send dogs to find them.
Yeah, let's be less literal in that. I think that's a really good lesson to take from this. Like let's look for that more nuanced sense of lostness. Let's look for that more nuanced sense of losing somebody in order to come together and show that they matter. I think that would go a long way in preventing a lot of those. Yeah, that aren't obvious and suffocating. Yeah.
Yeah, gonna get a negative response.
All right. Well, please share with us. I obviously, people might be listening to this because they see this topic, and maybe it's people that we don't know. And I do just obviously beseech anybody who's struggling to reach out for help. There are lots of resources for people. And I think in these two cases, the two people, especially in Elle's case, like, she just did not understand how much we fucking loved her. And that's the most frustrating thing. But
that can be the last thing you understand in a sense also, right? Like, despite this love, I still feel this way.
Yeah. Hard conversation, hard topic, but which we'll never exhaust, but we have to stop somewhere. So we'll stop now. Thanks, Patrick. Good to see you.
Yeah, good to see you too.